So hi again, Arthur. So what is it that you're doing right now?
So right now I'm cutting the hide that will go on the edge of the shield. This is, the hide that we have here it was purchased, it was restretched to be thinner, and then we basically carved out more of the kind of the softer tissues to really get down to, now people might call it a parchment thickness, but I mean this is still, it hasn't been processed in any way like a parchment would. So this actually is just rawhide. It's just incredibly thin rawhide.
I see.
But so that's what we're using for our edge material in this particular shield. And so right now I'm just, it's already been kind of sanded down to get to a uniform thickness, and now I'm just cutting out the strips.
I see. Okay. So this is what's going to go onto the edge, right?
Correct.
Okay, so these are the actual strips, right?
That's correct.
Yeah. Very thin, but surprisingly resilient.
Yeah, so this is the, they often refer to this in leather as being the top grain, but it's really that outer shell that gets really firm, like even with our skin, you peel off kind of those top layers and you get to that soft underside. Well, in a lot of thick hide, what you're actually dealing with is not the top. Many times they'll scrape off the top because this is the most valuable part, and they leave that big sort of piece down below, and it has a consistent consistency, but it is also a spongier type material.
I see.
Which is what you'll see on kind of all of these modern kind of massive hide rimmed shields that are on the wall. But that's what they're using. So this is actually the feeling of a top grain piece of hide, which is much stronger than sort of the underbelly that's all soft.
And thus it doesn't have to be that fat.
Right, it still have the same string. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, cool. Thank you.
Yeah.
For the beginner on this guy?
I would actually grab the one on the far left.
Yeah.
As long as you're, let me just see, as long as you're able to successfully aim where you want it to be.
Anvil bouncing is not going to be the best.
Even though it seems weird.
Little guy? Okay. That works.
Yeah, this one will move it the fastest. You're going to want to make sure you've got good extension. If the aim is off, then I just go to the slightly bigger but shorter handled one. Any of them would work though.
So this is what you will make a boss from?
Yes.
And
Use the peen side though.
Peen side?
Okay. Yeah.
Yep, so right now I'm just taking out the edge. Taking the flange around the side.
Yeah.
And then we'll use the swedges. This is the finishing swedge. Those are the two to get the bowl shape going.
I see.
it makes me wonder if in the times of going on a raid, if everybody would just kind of come together and start working on putting weapons together, shields together.
I would think so. It's kind of community time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So what you're doing right now is folding the strips that are supposed to go onto the edge.
Yes, exactly. I think. That's the math.
So what I've got going on here is
Yep.
animal hide. And the poor guy needs to be, and this is inside. And I believe we're going to try some experiments by
And a disc lying on the table, that's the planks that you glued to the rawhide or the hide on the other day, right?
Correct. And this is where I consider this more like the pilot hole, and the main reason for that is because we are hand hammering a boss.
I see.
It can be a little bit trickier to predict the exact size of the boss when it's completed. And so we sort of start with this little pilot hole. After we get the completed boss, then we'll, actually finalize the interior hole here.
I see.
Customize it
Yeah.
to the box.
Otherwise, the risk is your boss falls through.
That's not a good thing. Oh, I was.
try again. And it goes off.
So right here, I'm just checking for consistent thickness across the edge. And in some of the places where we get into the legs of the animal, the thickness will start to change a little bit, even though we kind of ground it down. So where the hide gets a little bit thicker, I'm just cutting that off. By having it consistent, it's more predictable how it will behave when we're kind of putting everything together.
I see.
And I have more than enough.
All right, so here we are back. Work has proceeded on the shield. So apparently you have already attached the edges that you had been cutting earlier on.
So the stuff right here, we sort of pre-folded it just to give it a nice crisp edge before it was applied using hide glue to the edge of the shield. And then we applied a layer of paint, and this paint is all based off of iron pigments. And so what you have here is FeO4, often called like fire scale.
Okay.
So as you forge things, you're constantly breaking off little pieces of metal, which combined with oxygen, they turn this really rich black color. If you grind that up into a powder and mix it with like linseed oil, it makes this beautiful black paint. And what we have over here in the red section, this is FeO3, so most commonly known as rust. So if you take a bunch of rust and you do the same thing, you grind it up, it makes also a very beautiful paint.
Do you just mix it with water or with oil? Or
Linseed oil.
Linseed oil.
Yeah.
Okay. So it's basically oil paint.
Right, so versus like this here, so this particular shield is using milk paint.
I see.
So there's, just in the Viking Age, there was a combination of paints that we found them using. Some has a milk base, some has an oil base. And then as far as what they use for the pigmentation, it was a range from vegetable matter to ochres, with different types of rock and earth material, as well as iron and metallic sources. But that's sort of the bulk of what you see. So even what's on here, this is a combination of ochre and vegetable-based pigments with milk paint as a base. Versus here we have oil or linseed oil base with iron in its various forms.
And are there any advantages or disadvantages using one or the other?
That's a little out of my depth from a scientific perspective. From a usage perspective, I don't think so. I mean, they do paint a little bit differently. I would say, an oil paint really does paint a lot like an oil paint, like a modern oil paint. A milk paint, I think, is a little bit more chalky. It's almost like like working with, if you could combine pastels with paint,
Yeah.
That's kind of the texture. It's a little bit different. But outside of that difference, I'm not really sure if there's any kind of mechanical properties or longevity differences and
I
things
see.
like that.
How quickly does it dry? Because I made the experience that linseed oil can take up to weeks to actually dry through.
So linseed oil,
depending on the thickness of the layer you put on.
so there's a couple of things you can do to help with that. I mean, part of it is if you evaporate out some of the water, so just let it dry and sit, it will tack up. That does help it dry faster. Or the other way, like what we'll end up doing here is I'm letting this paint permeate into the hide layer, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab a cloth and I'm going to wipe it off, so the vast majority of this stuff is going to be taken off, but you won't really notice any difference in the color.
I see.
But then that will end up drying so much faster. So part of the thing about oil paints is they don't really, at least in this age with what they were using for pigments, it doesn't really dissolve into the medium. It's held in suspension. And so what's different about these oil paints is all of these little fine-grained particles are just kind of floating in the oil, which you're then kind of coating onto here. When the oil dries, linseed oil will dry as kind of this hard, I'm trying to think how to describe it. It's like peanut brittle, I think that's a thing. It's sort of like this hard, crusty thing, but with all of the pigment suspended in it, it maintains that color. And so when we wipe this off, we're still going to have that nice thin layer of pigment that's kind of spread throughout. But it works quite a bit different than like a water-based paint where you're actually dissolving into the medium.
I see. And so regarding the plane of the shield, there's a little warp in the board here towards the side.
Yes. So based on, so in order to meet the timeline of our experiment, so the backside of the hide wasn't applied with quite as much precision as it should have been.
Okay, I see.
But even so, one thing you'll notice about this bend is it is really pretty subtle. And so because it is so easy to take the warp out, doesn't take much pressure, the handle itself will straighten out the boards.
I see. Okay, that'll be interesting to see. The handle is already carved, isn't it?
That's correct.
Okay.
Yeah. So this will be the handle that we apply. Right here.
Okay.
And
so that's the same wood as the planks?
Yes, that's correct.
And there's a specific cross-section that you chose to put on that one, right? Like it's a D-shaped cross-section?
Yes, that's correct. So this is the D-shaped handle. The other thing too is just kind of to show a Viking age repair. So this particular piece of wood was split, and all we did is we took some hide glue, put it into the split of the wood, took a bunch of leather scraps and just kind of wrapped it around until it dried into place. And this is just as solid as sort of an original piece of wood. So it's a great way to take and just repair a quick split.
And how much time did it take to dry?
Hide glue will set, depending on the strength of hide glue will actually set to where it doesn't feel wet within, I mean, sometimes as little as 5-10 seconds.
Oh, really?
For like a weaker strength, it could be, a minute maybe. But it takes, like mini glues, about 24 hours to fully cure.
I see.
But really, within that setting period, you can usually sort of move and interact with the object and still continue to work on it. But within 24 hours, it's fully cured. And it's like a rock.
Cool. Thank you very much.
My pleasure.
So here's Jaden coming back, and he's all sweaty. Why are you all sweaty, Jaden?
I've been cold forging the shield boss right here.
All right. So when did how many hours did that take you?
About 2.5, 3 hours.
2.5, 3 hours, and that's where we took the footage earlier this day. So there's no, that wasn't heated or anything. That was
Nope, that was all cold hammered. Yeah.
And how many of these have you done already?
This is the first one. That's probably why it took me 2.5, 3 hours.
Wow.
It's very beautiful. Very beautiful. Well done.
Thank you.
What kind of steel is this? Because I know you have done things from actual bloomery steel.
Right.
And because that looks really smooth, so what kind of material do we look at here?
Well, you can't really judge iron or steel based on how smooth it looks. So even if we were using, let's say, bloomery steel, if you don't let it get too thin, you can still have a really great silvery sort of steel-looking appearance on it. The advantage of the mild steel, like a modern steel, is that even if you end up getting certain sections of that steel excessively thin, it won't matter. It won't compromise the integrity of the steel. I mean, it is still possible, but it's much less.
And you have
likely to
experienced
happen.
that before, smelting actual bloomery steel and then using that. And you said there is a certain difficulty there, and it may completely change the look once you go past a certain thickness of
Right.
shield boss.
So actually, let me quick show you. I don't know if it'll come up on the camera, but for example, this is some bloomery steel. And the composition of this is a mix of bog iron as well as taconite, which is a
You
kind
just
of...
turn slightly, then the light from...
Oh, yeah.
That's it.
Now, if you look, and I don't know if it'll come across here, but if you look at kind of the edge, you'll see what look like really faint lines running through. And
Almost like a grain wood.
yeah, many people will compare it to a wood grain, and so when the bloom comes out of the bloomery furnace, you have this really massive thing that doesn't look anything like iron because there's a lot of slag content, and you have to pound that down into a consolidated mass, and then you start the folding process. And so what you see here are all of those layers. Now, the issue is that every one of these layers is not like a homogeneous piece of steel. These really are a bunch of forge welded components. And so as you thin out this steel, you end up potentially exposing the welds themselves, and that's what causes it to either delaminate or sometimes just punch a hole straight through it. And there are ways to help prevent that or make it a little bit harder. So like right now, all of these were run in the same direction, which meant it was folded constantly the same way.
I see.
Ideally, you would fold it kind of going back and forth, so you effectively have like this weird grid pattern, which can help when you're doing any kind of cold work or trying to thin out the steel. But regardless, this is a much harder thing to thin down than a modern steel.
I see. But that's the actual material that would have been used by, say, 10th century Scandinavians who outfit their shields with shield bosses.
Correct.
Yeah. And what divides it in terms of producing that material from the mild steel that you mentioned earlier on, which is the modern material?
Well, there's quite a bit from like a molecular level.
Oh, no, I'm talking about how you acquire that stuff. Like,
So there's very few places that you can purchase this today. Generally, you have to set up a bloom and smelt it yourself.
oh, I see.
That's the easiest way to do it.
I see.
It's also the most affordable, and that's a relative term because
And
it's
this kind
really
of furnace,
expensive.
what would you say is the major difference to furnaces nowadays?
It's primarily the heat that you can generate.
I see. Yeah.
So in most like modern furnaces, like the big blast furnaces, I mean, the heat they can generate is just like incredible.
Okay, and then they were just simply not able. They didn't have the technology to produce these heats, and hence there was less homogeneous material. Or
Correct.
okay, I see. All right, so it's not that they decided to have this kind of steel. It's just simply because it was the best they could come up with in regards to technology and raw materials, right?
Yes.
Okay. Well, thanks a lot. Very interesting.
You're welcome. That nail might be a little wide. Cap on its flanks. Is it on there?
That's slipped off.
Good. Good enough?
Yes, but short stickly. So
So you have just finalized that shield, right?
Yes. So we have affixed the boss, handle's been attached, and it's all ready for destruction.
Cool. I'm looking forward to it. So this took you, what, 2 days to actually make it? Ever since we looked
About
at
2 days.
attaching the boards to the planks to...
Keep in mind that it's 2 days after all of your material is prepped. But just, I mean, a lot of it's waiting, but it is a 9-month process to manufacture all the different parts. Total amount of time might be closer to 120 or so hours. But yeah, once all the material is ready, 2 days.
I see.
You didn't know what I did. At that period, he might have made it up.
I like the way the color turned
Well, he made
out.
other stuff up because he
I
writes
love these
something
colors.
about,
As you can tell.
It's on there too.
fingerprints and everything.
Oh yeah, that's good.